China is accused of a malign attack on Britain's democratic institutions with fears it hacked the details of 40 million voters. Well, joining me now to unpick this is the former military intelligence officer, Philip Ingram. Philip, thank you for joining me on this. How worried should we be about this? And I suppose the whole matter of our relationship with China, economic, political, security, is brought up when these things rear their head.
We should be very worried about it. China is gathering huge amounts of data on all of us by hacking into databases that they can exploit, by using and abusing data that is held in servers in China, and by traditional espionage techniques. And they're turning that round to then fire targeted disinformation at us to try and change the way we think about different things. This is something that they're doing not just the UK, but to everyone across the West.
And that can be things, I mean, you're the expert, explain to us about the kind of things that they are spreading disinformation about. I mean, we've heard sort of from the sublime to the important, but less important for the future of our country, and things like the Princess of Wales and attempting to destabilise the monarchy. But when it comes to politics, which I want to concentrate just at the minute, I mean, how worried should we be? We're in an election year, 3/4 of the democratic world is going to the polls. This is something that China, which is not a democracy, is going to focus on.
Well, we have over 60 elections across the globe this year, including your EU elections, at least 2 sets of elections, UK local elections and the parliamentary elections. We've, of course, got the US elections. And what China will be trying to do is create as much disruption around the West as possible, because if you put it into context as to what China's trying to do, it's trying to position itself to grow economically. So if it can cause economic distress around other countries around the world, it looks for opportunities, and it's a very opportunistic nation, and it will try and exploit those opportunities. So create discourse, look for an opportunity, and then exploit that economically. But it's also got territorial ambitions as well. We see Chinese vessels in and around Philippines waters, creating havoc and trying to stop the Philippines Coast Guard and Philippines Navy from operating in there. We see China trying to stop the international community from sending its warships through international waters in the Paracel and Spratly Islands in Southeast Asia. And we see China's aggressiveness against Taiwan. From a longer term perspective, I know we've got conflicts in Europe with Russia, Ukraine, we've got the Middle East brewing up, but from a longer term perspective, China is a bigger threat.
It's so sophisticated, it's so multifaceted, Philip. How on earth can we fight back against it?
The biggest way of fighting back against it is awareness. Awareness that they are gathering information, that they could be abusing that information and sending it back to us again. The genie is out of the bottle. It's virtually impossible to put it back into the bottle again. So what we have to do is limit what it can achieve, and we can only do that by awareness and by activity. It's no accident that HMS Queen Elizabeth, her first operational deployment was done into Southeast Asia and into waters that China is disputing. At least the government is beginning to recognize that, and international governments beginning to recognize the potential threat that's out of China. We've seen some of the impositions that have been put on the utilization of Chinese technology in our 5G networks and elsewhere. And we see the debate that's going on about Chinese social media apps such as TikTok, and you're questioning whether they are actually video sharing platforms or huge influence platforms and intelligence gathering platforms. And they're probably all three.
I can understand, and I think a lot of people can understand why the Chinese would want access to the voter roll, for example. That is something that we condemn it. We think it's awful. It shouldn't happen, but we can understand it. Why on earth does China really care about putting out disinformation about the Princess of Wales, for example? Why would they do that?
Because it creates discourse, and there's a wider group that there is here coming together, and we're seeing China working with other international partners, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And Russia is very good at this as well. So they're all feeding off each other. And China is the sort of the quiet sleeping partner in the background, but the one with access to all of the capabilities and all of the money that's helping to do things. Anything that causes discourse. There's the old Chinese proverb of death by 1,000 cuts. So if you do lots of little things the whole way through, nothing in itself in isolation is going to create something that's going to come back on China again. But put them all together and you're getting that political hiatus, you're getting that confusion, you're getting people focused on things that are not important or that they shouldn't be focused on. You're creating discourse. That discourse gives China an opportunity to try and exploit it, and primarily they want to exploit it from an economic perspective.
I want to ask you about Russia, Philip, as well, because we've had this absolutely horrendous attack, 133 people dying in the massacre in Moscow. There were lots of echoes of the Bataclan attack in Paris as well, but I mean, it's just some of the video, some of the details of what has happened, so many people injured as well. The Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has warned the UK should be concerned about the threat of Islamic State as well. Just explain to us a little bit about Islamic State, which have claimed responsibility for this attack and their role in Russia.
Well, we should be concerned, and France has just put its warning up to the highest possible level. So that usually means that there is intelligence suggesting that an attack is imminent. Russia has got a history of upsetting the Islamic State and Al Qaeda and elsewhere. We have to remember that a Russian aircraft was attacked flying out of Egypt in 2015, where 224 people lost their lives when an Islamic State bomb went off. In 2017, in St. Petersburg Metro, the Islamic State detonated a device that killed 15 people. Russia is working with Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and they are attacking the Islamic State strongholds that there are there. So Russia and Islamic State are sworn enemies, and therefore they have been on the target list for quite some time. The Americans gave the Russians a warning 2 weeks ago. The Americans got their timing slightly wrong. They thought the attack was going to be over the weekend a couple of weeks ago, but the detail in there was clearly accurate, because they said an area of public gathering, and they stopped or put a message out to say to Americans, don't go to concerts and other things. So Russia has got its focus on what's going on inside Ukraine, and therefore Islamic State has taken an opportunity to exploit the fact that Russia's security services are not necessarily focused on them as much as they potentially should have been, and the fact that they have, even though they were given a warning, they mistrust the Americans. So that gave them a bit of an open door.
Actually, Philip, just mentioning Ukraine, of course, President Putin has announced a day of national mourning because of this horrendous terrorist attack. He also made a bit more than a hint, I think, that Ukraine might have been involved in some way. Obviously, that plays into his political strategy and so on. But in this address to the nation, is that just from him disinformation in that regard?
Well, the Russians have got a doctrine called maskirovka, which is all about masking. It's all about throwing doubt out there. So he's talking to his domestic audience, having just been re-elected. We've seen the announcements of him growing his military by 2 armies worth. That's a huge number. We will see in coming days announcements of increased mobilization of turning Russian industries into more defense-focused industries as he moves towards more of a total war footing, and then to try and explain the economic shock that there is going across Russia. So it suits him to blame Ukraine in some way for this, but it's there's no way would Ukraine do this sort of thing, because it would play totally against what they're getting from support from the West and elsewhere. And the Americans wouldn't have put a warning out if there was any indications that Ukraine had been involved in it in the first place.
Sure. Philip Ingram, former military intelligence officer. I always learn so much talking to you. Thank you very, very much indeed.